From Identity to Identities. This is chapter 11 out of Francis Fukuyama's book entitled Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. From Identity to Identities. The 1960s witnessed the emergence of a series of powerful new social movements across the world's developed liberal democracies. In the United States, the civil rights movement demanded that the country fulfill the promise of racial equality in the Declaration of Independence and written into the Constitution at the end of the Civil War. This was soon followed by the feminist movement, which similarly sought equal treatment for women, a cause that both stimulated and was shaped by a massive influx of women into the labor market. A parallel sexual revolution shattered traditional norms regarding sexuality and the family, and an environmental movement reshaped attitudes towards humanity's relationship with nature. Subsequent years would see the emergence of other movements promoting the rights of the disabled, Native Americans, immigrants, gays, lesbians, and eventually transgendered people. Europe saw a similar explosion following the événement in France in May 1968. The old French left was formed around a nucleus of hardcore communists, whose sympathizers included famous intellectuals such as Jean-Paul Sartre. Their agenda remained focused on the industrial working class and Marxist revolution. In the 1968 uprisings, those preoccupations were displaced by many of the same social issues that were roiling the United States: the rights of minorities and immigrants, the status of women, environmentalism, and the like. Proletarian revolution no longer seemed relevant to the issues facing contemporary Europe. The student protests and widespread strikes that took place across France echoed similar developments in Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and other places. This generation of 1968 on the left was no longer focused single-mindedly on class struggle, but rather on support for the rights of a broad range of marginalized groups. So I wanted to just stop here and talk about the generation of 1968. This is a good place to sort of jump in to Fukuyama's book for one reason, because he does sort of frame everything in terms of this year 1968. This is sort of the flourishing and the kind of climactic moment of postmodern culture, when it was, when postmodernism became mainstream. And there was a political component to this that is very significant to what Fukuyama is going to say. So let's take a look. I just wanted to briefly sort of cover this year through images. So just to quickly give you a sense of the year of 1968. This is something from The Guardian. 1968, the year that changed history. It was a year of seismic social and political change across the globe, from the burgeoning anti-Vietnam War and civil rights movements in the United States, protests and revolutions in Europe, and the first comprehensive coverage of war and resultant famine in Africa. The world would never be the same again. So everybody recognizes that 1968 was a big year. At the beginning of the year, we have the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. So the Vietnam War is ongoing, and the Tet Offensive is when the North Vietnamese, the Viet Minh, were able to actually sort of invade Saigon. And in the midst of this, we have this image. So February 1st, Saigon, Vietnam, Chief Brigadier General Nguyen Ngoc Loan of the South Vietnamese National Police executes a Viet Cong officer with a single pistol shot in the head. Carrying a pistol and wearing civilian clothes, the Viet Cong guerrilla had been captured near Quang Pagoda, identified as an officer, and taken to the police chief and summarily executed. March 28th, Memphis, Tennessee, USA. A police officer uses his nightstick on a youth reportedly involved in the looting that followed the breakup of a march led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. March 29th, Memphis, Tennessee. National Guardsmen brandishing bayonets block civil rights activists trying to stage a protest on Beale Street. The marching demonstrators wearing signs which read, "I am a man," were also flanked by tanks. April, Memphis, Tennessee. The American civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., lying in state as his colleagues pay their respects to him. From right to left, the mourners were Andrew Young, Bernard Lee, and Reverend Ralph Abernathy. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th of 1968. Precisely to the day 1 year before, he had given his Riverside address where he explained his opposition to the war in Vietnam. And in the press, in popular media, at least amongst the establishment and mainstream media sort of personalities and outlets, Martin Luther King Jr. had become a sort of, pariah. They felt that his opposition to the Vietnam War totally undermined his whole program. So most people in the United States had very negative attitudes to Martin Luther King Jr. from April 4th of 1967, when he gave his Riverside address, all the way up until the day he was assassinated. Many people were in fact very happy to see this man dead. April, Hughes, South Vietnam. As fellow troopers aid wounded colleagues, a paratrooper of a company, 101st Airborne, guides a medical evacuation helicopter through the jungle foliage to pick up casualties during a 5-day patrol. May 1st, Britain. A black man walks past graffiti stating "Powell for PM," for Prime Minister, referring to the conservative politician Enoch Powell, who caused controversy with outspoken comments on black immigration and racial integration, particularly in his famous Rivers of Blood speech. May, Paris, France. A young woman challenges riot police near the Mabillon intersection, Boulevard Saint-Germain. May, Paris, France. Security forces block the entrance to the Place de la Sorbonne. June 5th, Los Angeles, United States of America. Senator Robert Kennedy lies sprawled, semi-conscious in his own blood after being shot in the head and neck, while Juan Romero, a busboy at the Ambassador Hotel, tries to comfort him. Robert Kennedy was running for president and was very likely to win. At this stage of the game, it looked like he would win by a landslide. He is shot. It's Richard Nixon that ends up winning the presidency this year. July 24th, Nigeria. A starving Biafran child huddles on a pavement. A large group of men in Biafra. August, Prague, Czechoslovakia. Emotional scenes as crowds gather after the Russian invasion. October 16th, Mexico City, Mexico. Extending gloved hands skyward in racial protest, the U.S. athletes Tommy Smith, center, and John Carlos stare downwards as the Star-Spangled Banner plays after Smith won the gold medal and Carlos the bronze in the 200-meter sprint at the Olympic Games. And then also from this photo diary of 1968, there is December. Apollo 8, viewed from the Earth, rising over the moon. The first time the whole planet was seen from space. And of course, this image becomes very emblematic of the environmentalist movement that Fukuyama was referring to. And it's in 1970 that the first Earth Day was celebrated. And organized in large part by Ralph Nader. Okay, there are some other details here that I wanted to point out, some other pictures. Let me see if I can find them. I want to look at this one. So in March of 1968, we have this photo. Notice the banner in the back, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? And that was the chant throughout the early part of 1968 is, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? There were even placards of LBJ being labeled a war criminal. And we have, images like this. This is sort of indicative of the presidency of LBJ in 1968. Recall that Lyndon Baines Johnson was the vice president when JFK, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. So he became president in 1963. And then, won re-election in 64, and now it's 1968, and he's, running again. But in March of 1968, LBJ withdraws from the presidential race and abdicates the presidency because he had lost touch with the broader society. He didn't feel that he could, fulfill his duty. So here's him preparing an address on on Vietnam in 1968. So then Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's younger brother, became the front-running candidate, and again was likely to win until he was assassinated in June. And then in August was the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and this is a picture of, so this is a hill. It's normally just like a green grass hill with a monument. I'm not sure, I can't remember who it is. The monument is of, but it's just packed full of people, especially young people. So there was a great amount of protest outside the doors of the Democratic National Convention. They went on to nominate Hubert Humphrey, who tried to, sort of fulfill what Robert F. Kennedy his agenda was, but he wasn't as strong of a media personality. Nixon was able to beat him out, but one reason that Humphrey didn't win is because during this Chicago Democratic National Convention, with all these young people, especially organized by the Yippies, Abbie Hoffman was a key figure here. He started the Yippie movement. He said, if the media can create the hippies, then we can create the Yippies, the Young People's International Movement, or the Young People's International Party. And, here's a pin that was worn by people at the Democratic National Convention in 1968. And again, it was just it was a mob scene. relatively peaceful, but it ultimately devolved into rioting, and the consensus, even amongst mainstream media, was that it became a police riot, that the police rioted against the yippies and other people outside on the streets outside of the convention. Um, there's a lot of cracking of heads and uh, quite brutal, quite severe brutalization of the young people there. That was in August. In May, as mentioned earlier, oh, and here's the flag of the Yippie party. So this is a very important part of the party propaganda and activities, was to fly this flag. 1968. And in Paris, this is a picture of some graffiti inside of a classroom during the uprising in Paris in May of 1968. And we see Karl Marx being referenced. But kind of similar to the avant-garde, only obliquely sort of political, sort of messages of like the yippies, where it was more about the counterculture more than about traditional politics. In France, Karl Marx was a traditional political sort of figure, and so that was part of the sort of uprising, was a call for some kind of Marxist revolution. But as Fukuyama mentioned, that was not the main thrust. The main thrust was more this counterculture sort of approach to a countercultural revolution. And it was a kind of revolution. It was just a cultural revolution. It wasn't really a political revolution. And here's a slogan that's pretty famous and was quite widespread, actually, in Paris during the uprising of May. Sous les pavés, la plage. Under the paving stones, the beach. Because in Paris, even to this day, a lot of streets are paved with cobblestones, and underneath it is sand. That's the foundation underneath. And so, this was really a call to dig up the cobblestones and to use those bricks to throw at the police and create barricades and all this sort of thing. But this becomes like a slogan. It's a revolutionary slogan, but it's not really structured in any traditional political framework. And so that's really 1968 is very much about a cultural revolution. And of course, this is in large part due to the baby boom. After soldiers came home from World War II, there was an explosion of births. And in 1968, that was when, a baby born in 1946, let's say, would be 22 years old. And of course, babies born after that were younger. There was just a big bulge of young people that were from 16 to 22 years old. And that really broke through in 1968.